Hello, I am Lisa Gardner, the CEO of OMS Strategic Advisors. And I'm also the host of the Uncompromised podcast, where we have an unwavering commitment to values, beliefs, authenticity, integrity, character that brings heart and care to an organization. I'm bringing you some of the business's brightest, uncompromised executives and thought leaders to discuss challenging corporate norms. Get ready for today. We have an inspiring podcast episode with Dupree Scoville, Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer at Woodbine Development Corporation, specializing in hospitality. Starting as a dishwasher at 16, Dupree's journey led him to expand Woodbine's presence on the West Coast before returning to Dallas as a managing partner. With a notable background in acquisitions and capital markets, he oversees Woodbine Legacy Investments, a private equity fund focused on upscale hotels. Recognized for his contributions, Dupree's passions extend beyond real estate to education, providing platforms to discuss and create unity among our leaders in the Dallas area, and combating human trafficking. Join us as we explore his remarkable journey and insights. Now, Dupree, I had to include this, and I wrote this out, and my husband thought I got it just right on point. And if you remember back, it was spring break 2023, so it was just this year.
Sure.
And my family decided to take our family skiing. Lawrence and I were resting after just one run on the slopes. We're panting, all out of breath. And we were at the bottom of the ski slope, and we were leaning against the gate that separates the slope from the walkway. We look up, and what seemed to look like an Olympic skier, I'm not joking, coming down the slope with snow flying around him in a huge flurry, coming at us at rapid speed, skiing from side to side in this rhythmic motion,
coming
our direction, with also the most impressive men's fashionable ski outfit. I'm not joking on that either. This man did a fast, hard stop inches from our feet and then took off his helmet with these big, bright, glowing eyes and a huge smile and said, "Well, if it isn't Lawrence Gardner." And Lawrence replied, "Dupree Scoville, how are you, man?" I mean, I knew at that moment, Dupree, even though I met you years earlier, I must reconnect with you. It was a very spiritual moment for me, honestly.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, hindsight is 2020, as they say. So I won't try and adjust that memory. I'll just leave it like it is.
Leave it like it is. And one of the first words out of my mouth, if you remember, was, "You have to meet my son."
You remember that?
You remember that? In which you did, and I want to thank you publicly for being such an inspiration to him and welcoming him into keeping in contact with you.
Of course.
And to be able to provide sound advice to him. So
that's my pleasure. He's a good kid.
Yes.
He's searching like we all were when we were around that age, but he's trying to kind of figure life out. And I admire. It's fun to get to learn a little bit more about how St. Mark's does it, just in terms of building and encouraging how you build the whole man.
Absolutely.
That was not something I had insight into, and just to see how intentional he was and purposeful about pursuing that with excellence. I was just really impressed with him. And in those scenarios, I've always found that you don't need a script. You just
right.
And you don't kind of dance around it. You may have an hour, and you may never get that hour again with that individual. And so when it comes to mentorship, I was just like, I've always kind of said, look, we'll just go right to it. Let me tell you what's important. And if it means something to you, then great. And if not, then that's great. But I had a guy who told me, he said, "Look, I'll invest in you and I'll pour into you all you want, but I'm not going to pursue you.
That's right.
You pursue me and I'll pour into you all you want."
Absolutely. So I was told the same thing.
Right. Mm-hmm. If somebody's going to take the time to pursue me, then I'm happy to try and figure out how to make time for that and see if we can't, something productive can't happen of it. So anyway, it was fun to get to meet him.
But I do want, in seriousness, Dupree, there is something so special about you and very intentional about you. And after reading about you is when I truly understood the depths. Actually, you are being used to heal our land and ultimately people. God has chosen you. I truly believe that. And your background makes your courageous efforts of addressing the racial divide or the challenges we have, right,
Sure.
more interesting and compelling for me. So I want to start in on the first question.
Sure.
I want you to tell the listeners where you grew up. I want them to hear about your community.
Sure.
And how did your community, your parents, shape you into the man we see today?
Well, sure. I'm always happy to do that. So I grew up in Preston Hollow, which was, I always just joke, it's the wrong side of the tracks from Highland Park. So, but I mean, I say that obviously jokingly. It's a well-to-do neighborhood, and it just happens to be positioned in a unique place where the high school, the theater, and actually Preston Hollow, Franklin, and Hillcrest, happens to be really diverse, even though it's in the middle of a mostly white neighborhood.
Right.
And so where we were, I guess, a little bit unique is that when I was growing up, my parents just committed to the public schools, and they said, this is what we're going to be about. And they did everything they could to try and get everyone else in the neighborhood to do the same thing.
Right.
And I think we had a unique position because I'm half jokingly described that we as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were the minority probably by the time I was maybe in third grade. And so, and it was also a really neat mix because I mean, I actually still have some statistics, but Preston Hollow was about a third of racial diversity.
Right.
Franklin was a little bit differently. As you go up to the higher grades, the white population became smaller and smaller. And that's not probably altogether that surprising because a lot of parents were choosing private schools as
Right.
their income potential grew, and as they wanted to have their kids have a different experience. But my parents were committed to the ISD, and I'm so grateful for it because it gave me a really unique perspective in life and a different empathy that I don't think I would have had otherwise, just because you grow up with friends of all different colors and
absolutely
and races and everything else and socioeconomic diversity, and a lot of that stuff didn't matter. And so, well, it mattered. I don't want to trivialize that because I think that can be brushed over. It mattered a lot actually, but I learned how to that in terms of friendship, that did not need to be something that was kind of a gating issue. And so for me, what was unique about it is I grew up in a house of three boys. I'm the youngest of three. We were all in a position where you didn't really need to be, we were all athletes in some form or fashion. And so what I found is that the playing field kind of literally levels the playing field, because it doesn't matter what color you are in those environments. Those your comrades, your battle buddies, your teammates, all those types of things. And so I really loved that experience. And so I think in many ways, some of the things that I've gone on to do later in life, and the reason that I feel like there's at least some call in my own heart and head and life to be able to try and address some of those differences and some of those inequalities is because of that upbringing. It's because I got a chance to grow up in a very diverse environment, and saw a lot of the things that opportunities that I had that others didn't. And so since then, it's just, I think, created that mission in my own heart to say, hey, there's a way to address that. And sometimes it's one kid at a time with mentorship, and sometimes it's something at scale, which we can talk about a little bit later, that we've tried to do to kind of bring more people into that cause.
Absolutely. I have a girlfriend I grew up with, and she says to this very day, she is a white female on the West Coast. She always says, because I grew up close with your family and you, my heart was tilled and ready for this. So she says, when I sit in a room in circles of those who all look like me, they don't realize who they're talking to, right? Until she says, I respond, right? Anyway, she's I sort of correlate to what you're saying with her. There's something about that when you are able to give yourself the gift of diversity, then you're able to feel, right? So, all right. So in establishing who you are professionally and the legacy you carry, could you share with our listeners a brief summary of Woodbine and its origin?
Sure. Woodbine was started by my father. It was a partnership with the Hunt family here in Dallas. And it was a pretty simple origin, actually. Mr. Hunt, who had been called to take over the oil and gas company that his father had founded, had acquired land or inherited land while he was in college. And so he then comes to a position where he needs to take control of the oil and gas company. And he kind of had this real estate portfolio, and he's like, I don't have time to manage that. I need somebody to manage it for me. And so he and my dad had crossed paths actually through some civic things they were involved with here in Dallas. And Ray basically said, he kind of talks about jockey betting is kind of his thing versus betting on the horse. And for him, he was like, John Scoville is the guy. And so he goes to my dad, approaches him and says, hey, why don't you come join the company and run this real estate platform for me? My dad at the time was a auditor for Arthur Andersen. And so he wasn't a developer by any stretch of the imagination, but at the end of the day, he reluctantly agreed. And I think he would say he was doing the same thing. He was betting on the jockey. He was betting on Ray Hunt. And that turned out to be a bet that both of them, I think, won on. And so that was kind of the foundation of the Woodbine origin. That company has then gone from what was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Hunt companies, which was really just developing and managing the assets that the Hunt family owned, to what we are today, which is now a wholly owned company by our family. The Hunts are still our partners, which is kind of amazing. In various capacities, they are, but no longer own the actual company with us, which is fun. But they're an investor in just about every project that we have ever done. And so that relationship has continued to grow. And we've been able to now grow the company to where my brother and I have acquired the business from my dad, which is kind of fun to see it go to a second generation.
Right.
We're really focused on hospitality development, but also land, industrial, office, and multifamily. So it's been a fun ride, and it's been neat to see the trajectory we've been on. I'm not bashful about it. I feel like there's been, you really can't look at our company and say we did it. I think you have to look at our company and you have to go, well, there's so many things in so many ways where I feel like there is providence in the decisions that we've made, and I think there's been guidance and along the way that there's really no other way in my mind to explain it except to say, look, the Lord has really just been gracious to us, and I think has been able to sustain this company in new and different ways. And so that's one of those things where I think it would be almost disingenuous to say, here's all the great things we've done.
That's right. That's right.
Just wouldn't feel right. So anyway, that's some of the things that I think we've been up to and how we've tried to grow the company.
Absolutely. Well, this segues into my next question. I wanted to establish who you were. I wanted to establish the success, generational success. And I definitely agree with you. Lawrence and I say the same thing about OMS. There are opportunities we've had that we definitely cannot take credit for ourselves. All glory goes to the Lord and opportunities that he opens up. So thank you for saying that. Dupree, we know that you could have taken a very easy route. You could have taken a route to ignore the issues or be a passive observer of the issues, right? In our city and nationally, and especially with George Floyd, right? I know you spoke a little bit before in the first question that, growing up in a diverse community helps you make a decision to do something at a grassroots level. But I want you to expand upon that. Tell me why you chose not to ignore it and have essentially taken and created a grassroots effort to make a change and begin communication among those who don't look the same and who do not come from the same socioeconomic backgrounds even and cultures.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is one of those things where I think I probably am a little bit careful talking about it because I don't want it to sound like it was some heroic effort. At the end of the day, it was, I found myself in a position where if to really go to scripture, to whom much is given, much is required. I think I was given a lot of relationships that happened to be on, let's just for lack of a better phrase, we're on two sides of the fence. In many ways, because of how I grew up and because my dad was in the real estate business for his his entire career, I knew a lot of the power establishment kind of king makers. So that was kind of one side of the fence that I was on. But then because of some of my own background and some of the things that I was involved with young professionals, I felt like I had a really good sense and really good relationships with a lot of the people that were the Black and brown folks in our business, which is, is not a ton.
Right.
So then the mission became, at that point, after George Floyd, it was going, hey, there's kind of two options here. Either you sit and you are paralyzed by saying, I don't know what to do, which I think is a fair and common reaction in that type of crisis. But then the question is, okay, well, I'm not going to be paralyzed because even my if I were to do nothing, right, that's as much as condoning what is happening versus saying, okay, now there is an action step that we can take. And so
Right.
it really was not as well thought out as it probably should have been. But the idea was, and this, of course, in the middle of COVID, it was saying, hey, why don't we try and get, again, for lack of a better phrase, these two sides in a room and at least initiate a conversation to be able to say, okay, we recognize that this is a massive moment in history that has created this watershed event where protests and all the like were going on. So what does that mean specifically for our industry? Do we just sit here and go, okay, this will blow over and this will go away? Or do we say, okay, well, what does it actually mean for us? Are there things that we could and should do in this moment? So really, that was kind of the heart of it. And lo and behold, I was shocked. Nearly 60 or 75 people, which was probably the only, I think, following COVID compliance was all we could have in this big ballroom.
Right.
We decided to kind of do something like that. And that then led to what has become kind of more of a speaker series. I can talk a little bit more about it, but that's kind of continued to be something where I've said, look, as long as people come, we'll keep hosting these events. Again, I'll talk more about that if that's helpful, but that was a little bit of how the origin came and where we felt like there was action needed.
Absolutely. Well, I want you to talk about the speaker series. I think that's very interesting. And when you talk about it, I want to understand the significant changes and outcomes you've seen out of this platform. I know that I have heard that there has been just huge movement and a huge benefit to these platforms. I know a lot of people who attend on a regular basis, including my husband, who's hit a few there and here. So talk about that as well.
Well, there's two things that I think some context is helpful. When we originally started, when this idea came up, there were several men Black men who I considered to be close friends that I asked to join a call, I think after that first event. And I like to organize things. I like grassroots things. I like to pull people together. I think that's one of the ways the Lord has gifted me. But and so I kind of had this type A, let's go conquer the world mission in front of me. And I assumed that would have been, at the time, of course, this is where there was a lot of police reform talk, but it was much broader than that. That was one really, really top of the wave sensitive issue that actually I think Dallas got really right. And I think Mayor Johnson got really right. But besides that point, there were so many other things below that were saying, okay, are there inequities that are happening within the city that we can address? So my heart and head was like, hey, let's go do those. I was talking to I just had a call with these men. I said, hey, look, here's kind of what the idea is. Maybe we ought to organize something where this happens on a more regular basis. It's geared to a larger audience where we can really start to have more intentional conversation about that. But I don't want to be the one that says, here's the outcomes that we need to achieve. Because like that would seem like how would I even know? How could I even possibly?
Exactly.
You know?
Right. So, I hear you. Yes.
So I asked these men, I'm like, it's your agenda. I can get the people in the room. What do you think needs to happen here? And I mean, it was just an really, really fascinating call because to a man, it was like, look, we appreciate where your head is, but that's not what it's about. It's not about trying to go to City Hall and make those changes, although those might happen. This needs to be about purely relationships. How do you start to create and bridge the gap between these two ends where that network doesn't exist on one side of that fence?
Right.
Where now commerce and trade and transactions can begin to happen, which is something that I happen to be passionate about, and I think can create and has created a lot of kind of I don't want to call it wealth transfer, but the ability for those two sides to actually begin to coexist.
I like the term wealth transfer. That's key. Yes.
So that was kind of I think that was a bit of the spark. So now we can go to what became this we'll call it a speaker series. And if I'm a listener, I'm going, how have they been doing this for, whatever it is, 3 years, and they don't have a name, they don't have, but that's the point. There is no name. There is no website. There are no sponsors. There are no committees. There are nothing like that. It's basically saying it is intended to be 100% organic. We get people in a room. I have kind of searched far and wide to find basically any and every civil rights hero that I can find in Texas. And we'll fly people in. Well, I mean, you name it, we'll do what we have to do to kind of get people there. But the folks that have spoken, a guy named Reverend Peter Johnson, who was on Martin Luther King's staff.
Yes.
Dale Long, who was in the 1963 Birmingham church bombing, he was actually in the building. When those 3 little girls died, and he just recalls this story in an amazing way. A guy named Omwale Latuli, who was a Black Panther at the University of Houston when there was a lot of integration and things going on there. And so what happens is you come into this room. We do it usually at the Holocaust Museum, which is fitting in a lot of ways in terms of when you think about oppression and slavery and things like that have long lasting effects. But these men or women, because we also had the grandmother of Juneteenth, Opal Lee, she came as well. But they'll speak on what the history of civil rights and or their struggle was like. But that's only one part of it. The other part is I'll usually have someone, a peer of mine, who will then step up on stage and say, hey, here's where I've experienced racism. And so what ends up happening, I think, the dynamic that we try to achieve is if you're sitting in the audience and you're thinking to yourself, I thought racism was dead. Now you have to confront 2 realities. Someone who experienced it from 1960 or whatever the year was, and then somebody who experienced it 2 weeks ago. On whatever caliber it happens. And so what happens is somebody goes, well, I thought it was dead, which is totally understandable, unfortunately, because we live in bubbles, and because
yes.
And I go, well, you wouldn't think racism exists because if you, and this is not intended to be critical, but if your kids go to an all-white school, if the church you go to is primarily white, if the neighborhood you live in is primarily white, if the country club you're in is primarily white, right? There's no reason you would have any coexistence to have to confront that topic. And that's really what I think people come away with from these settings as well. This is a lot more and a lot different than I probably would have expected. Now, that I think is meaningful, but it's actually in the big scheme of things, it's almost meaningless. And I'll get to why. That is important, and I think it does help set the stage. But then what we do is we break into homes, and what happens is we go and mix company in groups of usually 8 to 10 people, and these are amazing, devoted people that Lucy Billingsley, Ken Hirsch, Tom Leppard. I mean, I could go down a long list. I don't even want to leave anyone out, but that host these dinners in their homes. And are willing to say, hey, let's have this conversation. And that individual or someone there will usually serve as a moderator. And you're just asking intentional questions about race. Now, that's when real change happens. Because now you're in a much smaller company and you're saying, hey, here are a much smaller group of people. Now you're really talking about hard things. And so as good as the bigger group settings are, that's really just kind of the top of the waves. Once you break bread with people, and you're really starting to dig into a hard and tough issue like race, and you're having shared experiences, and you're talking about the first time you experienced racism. You're talking about how your parents dealt with racism or didn't. We were talking about how you have taught your kids about racism. That's the type of conversation that people come away from going, wow, now this is very different. And that's where real relationship is built. And that's where we've seen really interesting things happen. I mean, companies have been started, people have been hired, transactions have happened, banks have been created, nonprofits have been funded. I mean, you name it. Like, a number of things that have come out of this are really fun. And honestly, in some ways, I don't even feel like I want to know or need to know what happens. So I don't try and canvas the audience or do surveys to go, hey, what has actually happened? I just go, look, if the Lord sees that as valuable and people continue to come in, to those
Yes.
environments, and they're willing to engage in that way, we'll just kind of keep going. And then as the minute that it doesn't, which is, here's the reality about any event like a George Floyd event, as hard as sad as this is to accept, there's a shrinking window every single time one of these types of events happen. And this one was unique. I think, to use that analogy, how the window was shrinking pretty gradually, but then, I mean, slam shut.
Yes.
And there was this really kind of odd reflex because of how I think it had been politicized, unfortunately, in ways that I'm not sure that are fair to either side, because I think there's a wide swath in the middle that are really passionate about seeing healing take place here. But anyway, that was kind of some of the things that since then we've just said, look, if it keeps going, these kind of unique stories keep happening, people keep coming, we'll just keep doing it. And then the minute it doesn't, it's okay. That's all right. We'll move on to the next topic, and I'll continue to be passionate about it in my own life. But that's just one of those things where you kind of have to accept the reality of it and say, as long as the Lord blesses that endeavor, we'll keep moving.
Well, you talk about it at the beginning when an event, and especially like you said, George Floyd was an event where everyone got on the bandwagon. It was extremely, what do we need, right? Unlike some, you have continually sustained that level of intensity to want to address these things. You did not curve off after time had passed, right? You have continued. And so what has been your growth? When I say your growth, have you seen an increase in the number of people who've participated in this over time? You said you started with 60, 70 people. Where are you today?
Yeah, I would have thought, honestly, it's funny, it was actually 2 events ago. Now we do about 2 a year. But so 2 events ago, which I guess I'll call it about 9 months ago, you could kind of sense it in the environment and what was going on around the world, that now DEI had become like this really very sensitive topic, where very polarizing, kind of one side or the other. It's just unfortunate the way that it came about. I'll come back to talk about that a little bit, by the way.
Okay.
But so whatever happened there, all of a sudden I was like, this is probably, and I think we had an event kind of just after summer. And so the attendance was down at that one. So we went from 60 to about 350. And the way that we work is we send out an email, and
You've gone from 60 to 350. Did I hear that correctly?
That's right. But I'll tell you this, though, it wasn't really about, I mean, actually now the list is probably around 500. But we cap it, right? Because it really isn't about the numbers. What we say is the first 100, actually it's a little bit less than that, first 80 or so to respond is how we do it. And so they, for whatever, sell out, if you want to call it, in usually within about 24 hours of sending out that first email. And again, I would have assumed over time that would start to taper. And there was one event where it was not as well attended. This again was about 3 events ago. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, I bet that's probably the sign. I bet that's about the end of the road here. And we'll just but we'll do the next one. Sure enough, within 24 hours, 100 people respond. We were way over. And so we had to go hustle to find all these dinner hosts and do all this other stuff. So again, I'm a little bit surprised at how it's been able to do that. But the way we set it up is, to each person who attends, the only thing we ask is that you say who needs to be here. And so we can kind of broaden. And so it's not necessarily about someone having perfect attendance. It's more about saying, how do we expose that to more and more people, where again, those relationships can happen.
Yeah. My parents were part of the movement in integration in the 60s. They both were educators. And I remember growing up, and again, I'm from Kansas, the state of Kansas, if you can imagine. And I'm from Wichita, Kansas, which is probably the size of Plano and Frisco put together this current time. But I remember growing up, and I remember communication was the key in the implementation of what they needed to do in the state of Kansas for integration. And I remember who came to these grassroots meetings. My parents had built a house out in the country. And so their home was used a lot for these grassroots meetings. And I remember, of course, it was white people, it was Black people, we'd all come together. And there was such a consensus of how they were going to take the next steps in conquering, school systems within Kansas, right? And making sure things were done in an orderly manner. But a lot of what I have read about, I've never been to one of your events, so my goal is that I can go real soon.
Sure.
But it reminds me of that kind of platform. And those platforms are very effective in communicating, but true, genuine communication. So, as they're sitting at the home of one of the sponsors, it's making sure everyone is comfortable to speak the sincerity of
Sure.
what truly needs to be put out on the table. There's no conditions. There's nothing that would hold anyone back. And it sounds like that is what has been attained in those breakouts. So,
I think it's one of those things where because there's not a overarching agenda, I think there's two things that have happened. And I think there's also a lot of people you kind of have to give credit for. So
right.
Richie Butler, who was one of the men on that original call, has started something, you've probably seen some of the stuff he's done around
Yes.
The Together movement and
Yes, I have.
Well,
Yes.
Project Unity, like that dinner series format is really what we have used. And so I've obviously partnered with them on many different things. But I think the reason that ours has been, I don't want to call it effective, but I think the reason it's probably had some consistency is number one is I think for those who are not white would look at it and say, okay, this is not for a public benefit. It's not for some kind of, it's not for the newspaper articles or for this, that, and the other, or to try and get some kind of credit here and there. And I think because of that, because it's so low profile, I think there's an integrity to the effort that I think my Black and brown brothers and sisters can look at and go, okay, we're not doing it for some type of award or something like that. And I think then on the other side of it, I think the white folks can look at it and go, okay, this is kind of a safe place. It's not like there's not photos or pictures or this, that, and the other. It's a safe place for me to be able to go and say, hey, this help me listen, help me learn, help me understand. Right. So I think for whatever reason, it's kind of created a bit of a safe environment to do that. I remember a conversation I had early on with a guy named Dareth Jarvis, who's with JLL, amazing guy.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I've met him. Yes.
And he started, he started this group on LinkedIn where I can't exactly, I think it's like, we'll have to look it up, Lisa, maybe we'll be able to find it, but okay. I don't have it on the top of my head, but Dareth called me and he was kind of like, well, what's this about? I almost like why should I trust you?
Right.
And honestly, to him, I was like, hey man, I get it. That is 100%. That is 100% understandable that you're questioning this, going, what is this actually about? And so I just said, look, if you come and see what you think, and if you think that we're doing what we need to be doing, then great. And if you think there's ways that you can critique it or help us grow in it, then that's great too. And I think so. It's not one of those things where in that moment, I think if you got your own agenda and you're trying to accomplish something that's not necessarily for the real intent of what you set out to do, that can be offensive. It can be like, hey, why are you questioning me? Well, that's totally fair. Can you imagine? I mean, yes, you can't. You've seen this, but how many things have started and have gone away? And
yes.
Had a different vision or weren't actually what you thought.
Absolutely.
So, that's where it's like, okay, we've been able to kind of maintain that. And as I mentioned, I hold it with pretty open hands. Maybe there'll be one more event. Maybe there'll be a dozen. We'll just kind of see
we'll just see what happens. But I think it's key what you said. You haven't made it, you've kept it low profile, which has kept the integrity behind it, the sincerity, the realness behind it. Obviously, that is why the breakouts are working. I mean, I think that is such a good point. And I think the fact that you have not a name for it, I like that aspect of as well.
Yeah. On the emails, the only thing it says in the title is racial reconciliation. And so that's kind of it. And so people at least recognize that. Right. But anyway, I think it is you want to go back to one thing that we were talking about briefly on why I think this topic has been so politicized. And where I think DEI has now become this really unfortunate, sensitive term. But if I were to have a conversation with somebody, a leader in industry, and say, hey, look, you and I have been afforded a lot of opportunities, right? And we know that those who didn't grow up in the same environments we did don't have those same opportunities. And so let's try and figure out how we can actually help. Let's figure out how we can help address that and create opportunities for kids or individuals, men and women, who don't have that same opportunity or advantage that we had. To a man, you would have 100% consensus. There's no one that would disagree with that.
Absolutely.
But the minute you say, hey, diversity, equity, inclusion, like this needs to be a part of what our company's about. Somebody goes, no way, no. I'm not forced into anything. I'm not doing that. Where it's like, so that's what's unfortunate, is this buzzword has been almost hijacked and taken hostage. Whereas the heart behind it, I don't think you have many people that would say, hey, I'm not for that. And I do say this when I get a chance to talk about it, but I think a lot of credit has to be given to Bob Selenick at CBRE, to the folks over at JLL, to a lot of these bigger companies who really are intentional, I think, about seeing that change.
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
For what it's worth, I think they're doing the making a change.
Yeah, they are. And I think that, as we look at it, I think sometimes the wording has changed to maybe looking at it from a cultural standpoint versus diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
But whatever it is, all of it is focusing in the right area. The idea is, how much are we going to execute and implement and keep on pushing to get there? So, and you went right into my next question. And so I'm going to skip, but I wanted you to explain diversity, equity, inclusion to those who are trying to understand the importance of it within our professional social platform organizations, which I think you hit on that well. I'm going to segue into this because I think I read a quote by you, and I like the way you defined this terminology. Can you educate our listeners the definition of white privilege and give an example?
So this was an interesting topic. We had a group of guys. We have a call that group of guys that I went to graduate school with. We have a call just about every month, not quite every month, but usually on that cadence. And it's mixed company. You have a whole host of races on that call.
Yes.
And one of the folks on that call was surprising, because just in terms of his position on white privilege and some of the things that come along with it, we were just surprised that his reaction was really like, hey, I don't know that necessarily exists. And I kind of, and I think there was some hurt there and some repair that, kind of had to happen amongst those relationships in that regard. But what we really kind of came to look at, and I think you have to be careful when you address those types of situations where you don't ever attack the person, right? You just try and attack the issue and say, okay, hey, here's kind of how I can explain how it exists in my own mind and heart. And so the way I described is, look, I don't think it is I think there are industries where white privilege in some ways has been designed to maintain the status quo of that industry. So
absolutely,
my comments are not intended to suggest that white privilege or whatever comes along with it is something that is, a total accident. That's not to say that's the case, but to give an example of how I think that shapes the real estate business, which is the only example I could give him. I was like, look, I don't know what the statistics might say about the police force or about investing or about farming or about something else, but I can tell you how it works practically in the real estate business. Is a friend of mine who I went to college with, who I was in the same fraternity in. And that college and that university and that fraternity, all those demographics there, let's say, are 95% white.
Yes.
But now that individual is going to call me and say, hey, my son is graduating high school or he's graduating college. Would you mind talking to him and seeing if there's a place for him to fit? Now, he's not by design saying, hey, I am going to make sure the real estate industry stays white. But because my network is largely a white network, because my closest friends and the kids that I now know by extension of their parents have grown up, and I know how smart they are, and I know what they've done, and they've done all these complex things. Those are naturally the first people that I'm going to, interview, right? And so
Yes.
it creates this funnel, which there's a bias to that funnel just by relationship. Again, and I think, and not in all cases, but in this case, not necessarily intentional, but
Yes.
it is a scenario where all of a sudden now you've got this funnel that's been created, and of course that's happening times 1,000, times 10,000 in our industry. And so because of that, you see that funnel, and that's the way it kind of regenerates. And so that's the thing where you have to be really, and I mean, I'm not preaching here for a minute, but
Right.
we as business leaders then have to kind of acknowledge that and say, what is the way to break that cycle? Whether it's the Rooney Rule that the NFL has put in place or something else, but it's saying, hey, we can't just go straight to that funnel. We have to think about how you diversify the funnel. How do you start to interview folks that are not within your immediate network? And it's harder. It is, everybody says the same thing. But how do we recruit? Where to recruit? There are 100 organizations that are trying to solve that. There's HBCUs, there's Paul Quinn College here locally. There's 100 other ways that you can address it. It is a lot harder. It's a lot more time consuming. It creates a lot more interviews. But that's just the fact. You go, okay, well, if I'm going to address it, I got to actually address it. And so that's where I would say, Lisa, I've seen, at least in my own life, where I think white privilege has kind of manifested itself. And again, I try to describe that very matter of factly to go, hey, I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming anybody else. It's just a fact of how those relations work. We acknowledge it and we go, okay, if we really do want to do something about it, then let's start thinking about how we can give those folks of color an opportunity to be able to enter into that funnel and be in a position where years from now that begin to change.
So Dupree, share with our listeners what you've done. How have you shifted, your community or integrated your community so that you begin to,
Sure.
I think I'll use my son as an example.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So what else have you done? How can you help someone who's looking at this podcast saying, well, what do I do? I think, and one of my questions was there's another good friend, a white male, I won't say his name, who's very well respected in the commercial real estate industry. He said after George Floyd, he made a choice to diversify his life in all aspects, including socially. Yeah. Right? He no longer wanted his friends or social circles to look the same. Right? Okay. And he lives in Preston Hollow. He lives in the community, but he has been very intentional. So what are your thoughts on that? And that, is that something that you have committed yourself to, that kind of thing? So
sure. Look, this is the part that I think is actually kind of fun for me to be able to confess, be able to admit, be able to broadcast. Yes. We looked at Woodbine and we're like, oh my gosh, we have a decent amount of, we're a small company at the end of the day. Usually it's somewhere called between 25 and 35 people. Right. But as we looked at our company, it was largely white, and not like that was a new revelation, but it had a lot more light on it now that we were saying, hey, we're going to be about this. And so we had to look at every hire different, right? And so, I mean, I'm actually really proud. 4 of the last 6 hires that we have made have been underrepresented minorities. And so, and again, that takes longer. That takes intentional pursuit. That takes like kind of tapping all circles. I think the other thing that because that's one thing, and I do think hiring is kind of the primary instrument that we have as industry leaders to be able to create change. But again, if you are sitting in the room with men and women of color at dinner, breaking bread, doing those types of things, I think what happens is, at least for me, I start to realize all the environments that I'm in where those people are not there.
Yes.
I start to notice that, which is the exact opposite of what Lisa Gardner would feel. Because Lisa Gardner walks in the room and goes, and probably at some level goes, this is old hat. I'm always the only Black person in the room. But in some ways, I think it's interesting because the reverse of that, I start to go, wow. Once again, I'm in another room where there is not a single Black man or woman in the room, or there's a few, right? I mean, I don't want to make it sound too extreme, but I think that's where you start to go, okay, if it's a birthday party, if it's a group of couples going out, if it's an event, if it's this game, that it's saying, how do we be intentional about making sure that we are in mixed company, and people can see that, and people can exchange that. And so,
Mhm.
there's probably like the big thing layering, and there's a little thing like, okay, what's our day-to-day life look like?
Actually, my next question was this. Can you share with our listeners, especially who have children, how are you teaching your children not to compromise?
Oh, well, sure.
Who they are personally when it comes to culture, racial, female, and male differences. Share ages of your children as well, if you could.
Sure. Well, we've got a range. We've got middle school all the way down to preschool. I've got 4 kids. And so
Right.
but the thing that I often talk about with them, Lisa, is really just being comfortable being different. And I think as my dad used to say this, I always thought it was funny. At the time, you see a household of 2 or 3 or 4 kids, and sadly, there may be one kid that kind of goes a wrong direction. And I would always kind of hear him wonder out, almost out loud, I don't understand that. Like, how's that possible? And they've got the same environment, the same 2 parents.
Right.
Now that I have my own kids, though, I'm kind of like, I don't even know. My kids are so different that
Yes.
I feel like I have a different perspective. I don't even know how they can stay on that they're anywhere near close to being inside the lines, because they're all so different.
Right.
And I think so. What the thing that I've tried to really kind of double down on with our kids and have a consistent theme in our household is, look, we're Christ followers, and there's going to be things that we believe that are not always popular, and there are going to be things that we believe and we do that may not line up with what culture thinks, or how culture wants us to think, or how the world is generally moving, and that's totally okay. And
That's
it's
right.
really trying to give them the freedom to be able to say, hey, you that's okay to be different, and it's okay
That's right.
it's okay to kind of stand alone at times, because a lot of
Yep.
times what that means is like you're willing to be and stand for things that are just and
Mhm.
right, and for those
Absolutely.
who are underrepresented and those who are marginalized. We talk about that a lot. Like, that's part of what our mission is as a family, is to say, hey,
Yes.
those types of folks, the folks that are not loved, that are marginalized, that are on the outside looking in, we want to notice those people, and we want to go there. We want to be able to
Mhm. Mhm.
love them.
Mhm. That's great. And let me tell you, I'm going to wrap it up here, but what have you noticed with people who are capable of initiating change? What do they seem to compromise the most?
I think probably one word comes to mind. Um, Probably comfort comes to mind, because I think it is generally it is much safer, and it's much easier to not do those things, to not stand up, to not, you know, put yourself out there about standing on an issue. It's way more easy, way easier to mind the home front, to be a good husband, to be a good dad, to coach the teams, to do all those things, to really focus on the business and do that kind of stuff. But if you're going to stand up, if you're going to do these, if you're going to put yourself out there on issues, if you're going to kind of say, hey, I'm committed to moving the needle, it means like you're not going to be comfortable. You're going to be in environments you're not comfortable in. You're going to be meeting new and different people that you didn't know before, that think very different than you, that may have a whole host of beliefs that are entirely different. But the goal then is going, okay, well, even in that situation, how do I find the common ground? And so I think comfort is what is most often sacrificed if you're willing to go out there. And that's
Mhm.
probably the hardest thing for all of us to sacrifice, because
Mhm. Mhm.
what this life teaches us about is that it's so much about us. It's about what we're supposed to get, how
Yes,
we earn our place, and then how we make sure our kids don't have to work as hard.
that's right.
And I don't know that that's the way it's intended to be. I know so many men and women who are fighting on so many different fronts, whether it's military or mission field, who have massive sacrifices,
Yeah. Yes.
they've made and taken. And so I kind of think there's well, anyway, there's some wisdom in that
There's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. And I guess my just a follow-up, just to, when you choose to do nothing, and like you said, who much is given to, much is, needs to be returned, what when you choose to do nothing, are you becoming part of the problem? That's
yeah,
that's the
you
question.
one way. I don't even know if it's a question, honestly. Like, you're complicit. It's just whether or not you're willing to accept and admit that, or not.
Yes.
and so,
Ex-
and that's, again, not to try and sound pious or critical,
No,
but
no, no, not at
just
all. But
calling a
still,
spade a spade. That's what it is.
any last words for for our listeners? Anything that you'd like to say, what has brought joy over the years in your career? Any new initiatives you have on the horizon besides the racial reconciliation? Anything that, the Lord has dropped in your spirit that you'd like to share? But
well, there's always something. I mean, I think, for those who are in a covenant relationship, marriage is the prism through which we view the world. And I think there's a lot of time and attention that we can devote to many other things outside of that. And I've kind of found right now that man, there's so much work that I need to do there that says, hey, I can be about a lot of things that are outward facing. And even to the extent that I feel like I'll love on these kids and just do everything I can to be so involved with them. But a lot of times I think the consistent theme, as I kind of talk to my peers, is that sometimes the most sacred relationship is the one that gets the least attention. And so that's one where it's like, there's something there that I feel like there's a new challenge in my own heart to go, hey, how do I really make sure that we're spending the time we need to spend to be able to really focus on each other and allow, because that becomes central to everything else we're doing.
Absolutely. Our first ministry is our family. And the first ministry was the day you got married. Is that the truth? I'm gonna leave on this too, is that, Lawrence and I've been married 25 years. And one thing that I've noticed through the 25 years, we go through these cycles where we're very intentional. We pray together, we study together, read together daily. And there have been times when we have not, we do it individually. But here's one thing I've noticed: when we're intentional about our unity, there is something that flows down. There is a blessing, there is fruitfulness, there is a prosperous hand for our children. Everything flows down because there's a scripture that says it's with unity we can command the blessing. And that's why we find when we are disconnected as one, if there's something trying to sift through there, it feels like nothing else can go right. And so I just want to say I am just so proud of you. And I want you to know I've just been blessed. I have been blessed by you on several occasions. So thank you.